Yes, good morning. It's Tuesday, the 29th of September 2020. Welcome back to the best on-ground weekday kickoff, where we fire you through five of the biggest stories making waves in the world of sport. And as always, I'm joined by one of Australia's top journos. Today, we're crossing down to Melbourne to Natalie Yoannidis. How are you, Nat?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Pete. Everything's starting to look a little bit better down here since we last spoke. So we're all up and about.
That's exactly what we want to hear, and fingers crossed that things do keep tracking in that direction. Now, there's so much happening in the world of sport. We've got AFL and NRL finals just around the corner. We've got the summer of cricket not too far away. We've even got a Bledisloe Cup to think about next week. So there's plenty to chat about. Let's rip straight into it and dissect five of the biggest stories from this morning's newspapers. And we're going to start in rugby union. A story from Wayne Smith in The Australian, where he says that South African rugby is poised to quit Super Rugby within the next 24 hours and commit to Europe. The 25-year association of SANZAR, being South Africa, Australia, New Zealand rugby, and of course in recent years an Argentinian and Japanese team in Super Rugby as well, does look like it's coming to an end. Within South African rugby circles, Smith writes that it's regarded as an open secret that the South African General Council will vote to send their 4 Super Rugby clubs into the Pro 16 competition. Of course, Pro 14 at the moment, involving Italy, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and 2 South African teams at the moment. That will become a Pro 16. Those 2 South African teams, the Southern Kings and Cheetahs, likely to leave that competition with the Sharks, Stormers, Bulls, and Lions to move into the Pro 16. A lot of people have talked about this happening for a long time. It makes sense from a time zone perspective, and certainly gives an opportunity for Asia Pacific and Australia and New Zealand to focus on a Super Rugby competition well and truly in their own time zone. Do you think this is going to have a positive influence on Super Rugby's attempts to capture the hearts and minds of the Australian public? Or on the flip side, do you think that, you know, that 25 years of rivalry with the South African teams is something that's going to be missed?
I think that this is probably the best thing that could have happened for Australia's domestic competition. As you mentioned, it's been on the cards for such a long period of time. Of course, the Cheetahs and the Kings had already gone up to Europe, and you mentioned the time zone as well. So it's always made much more sense for South Africa to play with those European sides. As far as Super Rugby and ratings have been concerned, South African games have always been a huge issue. Having worked at Fox Sports for a long time in rugby, it's those games against South African teams that have really struggled ratings-wise, particularly those early morning games, those 2 a.m. matches, which obviously don't really suit the Australian public. So I think this is the best thing that could possibly have happened. I think that Australian rugby fans also aren't huge fans of the way that South Africa plays. Their style of game has always been a little bit more forwards focused. There's not always been as much running rugby. I think the Lions have been pretty good in recent years with their backs and, you know, introducing that running rugby style. But as generally speaking, the South Africans very kick-based, very forwards-based. So as far as Australian rugby, running rugby is concerned, this is a huge win for Australian rugby fans. And I think we could see a renewed interest in the competition if it is an Australia, New Zealand and potentially Pacific Island comp.
Yeah, and I need to say again, I've said it on the show before, we don't talk about what we're going to say before we start recording. So I don't know how you're going to respond to the questions. We just talk about the topics we're going to discuss. But you've hit the nail on the head. This is exactly what Australian rugby has needed for such a long time. I mean, I even looked last year, and Rugby Australia, for example, can only deal with what, you know, the cards they've been dealt. But when you saw a press release saying, oh, there's only one game being played after midnight this year, that's a great result for Australian fans. There's no other competition with any matches kicking off at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work for kids. And it doesn't work in terms of building rivalries. How many people in Melbourne can say they've got a rivalry with a team from Pretoria? Or how many people in Canberra can say they've got a genuine rivalry with a team from Durban? It just doesn't make sense. There's no tribalism associated with it. The other thing that it does, for so many years, New Zealand rugby threatened that if Australian rugby wanted to leave South African rugby, they'd fly over the top of us and play against South African teams. So important was that rivalry to them. well, gee, haven't we seen a shifting of the guard in terms of the power balance in Australasian rugby over recent months? And this just strengthens Australia's position, their desire to retain 5 teams moving forward and to play a pivotal role in the redesign of Super Rugby and what that might look like with, potentially, as you say, Pacific Island involvement and Japanese involvement as well. So a great day for Australian rugby. I'm certainly up and about with the news, and there's no disrespect to South Africa. I hope we continue to play them regularly in the Rugby Championship if that's able to happen. But saying that, this could be the precursor to them moving north from that aspect as well. Time will tell. Our second story today, we turn to the AFL, and it is AFL finals time. But there's been some pretty exciting things happening behind the scenes for some of the players in the AFL hub environment. St Kilda's Jaron Geary and the Western Bulldogs' Josh Bruce have both welcomed children in the last few days. Children who, I dare say, at the start of the year were not anticipated to be being born in Queensland, and that's pretty reflective of the sacrifice some of these players have made to get that AFL season up and running. For Western Bulldogs Premiership skipper Easton Wood, he's actually going to now enter finals without his family by his side after his pregnant wife Tiffany and their daughter Matilda returned to Melbourne on Monday ahead of the birth of their second child due in early November. I want to talk not necessarily so much about the sacrifice the players have made, but it's important to acknowledge that again because it has been enormous. But I actually want to talk about the St Kilda and Bulldogs match that's happening this Saturday at the Gabba. I think it's been a little bit of the forgotten final. It is an elimination final. First time we've seen the Saints playing finals football in 10 years. The Dogs, we know since they won that premiership in 2016, they've been pretty inconsistent since when you look at the calibre of some of their players. How do you see that one playing out, Nat, and why do you think it is getting the least attention of all the finals?
I think as far as premiership contenders go, the St Kilda Western Bulldogs game doesn't really have, in a lot of people's minds, in the general punter's mind, St Kilda and the Western Bulldogs probably aren't going to go all the way when you're thinking of Geelong, Richmond, Port, Brisbane, and then even the West Coast. And you probably can't write off Collingwood, let's be perfectly honest. So it is the forgotten game, but it's also potentially one of the best matchups that we're going to see. It's very, very even. And it's super exciting. I think that most people would say that either St Kilda or the Western Bulldogs are their second team because, yes, the Bulldogs did win in 2016, but they haven't had a huge amount of success over their time. They've only won, I think it's 2 premierships now, where the Saints have only won 1. So a lot of Victorians will be very interested in this game because, let's face it, if you don't go for Collingwood or for Richmond, you probably hate both of those sides. If you're a Victorian, that's the general rule. So I think a lot of people are going to be getting behind these 2 teams, and I think it's going to have a lot of interest in this match. Both young sides with a lot of talent coming through, big futures. I know we've been saying that about the Bulldogs since last season, since we thought they might go deep in finals last year. But this is a really exciting game as far as matchups go.
The Bulldogs, I mean, we talk about the fact they only won a premiership 4 years ago, but they have seen a lot of change in their side during that time. I referenced Easton Wood as the premiership skipper. Of course, he's handed the mantle to Marcus Bontempelli, who, as a side note, is probably my favourite non-Melbourne Football Club player to watch in the competition. But, 2 big storylines for the Dogs. Tim English in the ruck. He got bullied by St Kilda's Rowan Marshall and Paddy Ryder earlier in the year, but he's coming on tremendously and looks to have an enormous future. And also Aaron Norton, the young key forward who comes into the match, off the back of a fractured cheekbone. He will wear a helmet, but again, enormous potential in this young man. Both of them need to have good games for the Dogs to win, don't they?
Yeah, don't worry about a fractured cheekbone holding Aaron Norton back. He will be playing at full tilt regardless of whether he's got a helmet on. He's an absolute star. He's been fantastic for the Bulldogs. They really missed him when he was injured a little bit earlier in the year. He just completely transforms their forward line. So he's going to be particularly important. As for Tim English, he has really struggled against genuine ruckmen over the last couple of years. Games against, Collingwood when they've got Brodie Grundy. You've already mentioned the game that they played against the Saints. And St Kilda have got 2 pretty quality ruckmen in there with Rowan Marshall and Paddy Ryder. So this is going to be a pretty important battle, you'd have to say, particularly if you want to be getting the ball to Marcus Bontempelli in the middle. He can, really take the game by the scruff. So that's going to be a really important battle. You mentioned the player turnover at the Western Bulldogs the last couple of years. It's really hard to believe that they're back, playing finals and, potentially looking at semi-finals, going into the second week of finals, given they did have such a big player turnover, the likes of Jake Stringer, Luke Dalhouse, just to name a couple. They've almost gone through a mini rebuild, and yet to be back playing finals within a couple of years is really exciting and a real testament to the coach that Luke Beveridge is.
Yeah, he certainly brought through some exciting young players at the Western Bulldogs. Our third story today, not about an exciting young player, but an exciting player in a different code who I love watching in full flight. That's Kieran Foran. He's had a shocking run with injuries since he left the Manly Sea Eagles in 2015. He's played less than 13 matches a year on average in the last 5 seasons with the New Zealand Warriors, Parramatta, and also with the Bulldogs. But he's signed to go back to Manly to re-establish that connection with Daly Cherry Evans and with Des Hasler. Confirmation of that deal being signed yesterday. How exciting is it for Manly Sea Eagles fans, and how big of an impact can Kieran Foran have if his body decides to play ball?
Yeah, Foz is coming home. Who would have thought a couple of years ago? I mean, it's been a huge journey for him, obviously, with Canterbury, with the Warriors as well. It's been long, it's been arduous, but now he's back at Manly. I think that Manly fans are excited to see him back. It is almost like a favourite son returning to the club. Where he fits into this team, though, Pete, is going to be the interesting question. Obviously, they've got a lot of really talented backs in that Manly side. You think of Trebojevic, you think of Daly Cherry Evans. So where does Kieran Foran actually fit into this back line? I think it's going to be something that's going to be really interesting to see over the next, the next couple of months.
Yeah, there's a bit of suggestion that Des Hasler would actually play Foran as a dummy half. Hasler's quote here, Kieran's just a footballer. One of the strong parts of his game is his versatility, his ability to adapt. So it's a real focus for bringing him back to play that 9 role. However, it must be said that Foran has only played, in fact, he's played 211 of his 213 NRL games in the halves. So that change to hooker would be a massive surprise at this late stage in his career. We know Des Hasler is a bit of a mad professor, so don't rule anything out there. That one came from Dean Ritchie and Nick Campton in the Daily Telegraph. Our penultimate story today comes from The Age and John Pierrick. And, we talked about good news for Melbourne. Well, that good news is only going to continue with Melbourne's grip on the Boxing Day test tightening. The developments and the falling COVID-19 cases as the Victorian government, Melbourne Cricket Club and Cricket Australia all united in their belief that the Boxing Day test will remain at the MCG. We saw some massive schedule announcements yesterday for the Australian Summer of Cricket with confirmation that Australia's one-off test against Afghanistan will not go ahead and will be postponed to a later time. And also a 3 one-day international series against New Zealand in late January being put on ice. I know the Kiwis will be disappointed about that. But what it does is it allows some of Australia's star players, the likes of Steve Smith, Pat Cummins, Marnus Labuschagne, to return and rejoin the Big Bash League. Can't help but think that these scheduling changes have come about as a result of conversations and negotiations between Cricket Australia and Channel 7. We know the broadcaster's been really unhappy about the schedule and the summer ahead for cricket and has been looking to renegotiate its broadcast deal, and Cricket Australia hasn't been all that keen to budge. So we're going to see a little bit less international content, but we're going to see those star players playing in the Big Bash. Overall, Nat, do you think there's some blue sky ahead for Australian cricket after a few weeks of horrible speculation?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really exciting to think that we're going to have a Boxing Day test. Listening to the Premier Daniel Andrews speak, it's a question that he gets asked a lot in these press conferences. I mean, they do go for almost an hour every day, so they touch on a wide variety of issues. And the Boxing Day test match is one of them that does often come up. And just a couple of weeks ago, he was saying, yep, we think this is going to happen. We think the Australian Open's going to happen. And we think we're going to have at least 25% in there. So 25,000 people at the MCG watching India and Australia go head-to-head is a really exciting prospect for Australian cricket, because a couple of weeks ago, it didn't look like it was going to happen. We were talking about it being potentially in Adelaide, potentially in Perth. Now, all of a sudden, things are starting to really look up. It's going to be really exciting, I think. And you already mentioned, having those big name players in the Big Bash. That's been Channel 7's big issue with the Big Bash, not having that star power, that star talent coming in. So potentially having some bigger names playing is certainly going to please the broadcaster and potentially put that little battle, that little legal battle to bed, or certainly lessen it from Channel 7's perspective.
Yeah, and that would be great to see. We turn to our final story today in a sport which generally we're used to seeing playing in competition to the Big Bash, but may not be the case moving forward with the A-League considering a shift to winter. Dominic Bossy and Sydney Morning Herald's gone through and done a bit of a deep dive into the ways that the A-League's standard of play changed when they returned from the COVID-enforced break and finished their season in winter. Certainly, the best teams in Australia were operating at 90% of the pace of the quickest teams in Europe and Asia. That's compared to when they play in the peak of summer, when that can drop to as low as 70%. Clearly, the standard of football was better, and we've seen a number of current A-League players and former greats of the game here in Australia backing that move into winter, which is when football is traditionally played around the world. Flip side of that, you've got a little something called AFL and its little mate called NRL as well to compete with if you're playing in winter. And certainly from a commercial perspective, there's enormous challenges there. We look at some of the numbers, a 14% drop in Foxtel ratings from last year, despite the fact that fans weren't in stadiums. And the Sydney Morning Herald reporting last month that the A-League's media space had shrunk by 2/3 during winter. That 14% drop was just for the grand final alone. It's a really challenging situation for a competition which is desperately trying to remain viable and relevant here in Australia. Final one today, should the A-League prioritise standard of play or audience share in planning their future seasons?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, isn't it, Pete? Of course, all the football purists out there will say that it needs to be played in winter because those people are going to watch the game regardless. If it's in summer, if it's in winter, those people are going to be watching and they want to see a higher quality game. Having been a journalist down here in Melbourne, we have 3 A-League sides, but then we've got 9 AFL teams and we've got the Melbourne Storm and the Melbourne Rebels. So A-League sides probably aren't going to get much, if any, coverage in Melbourne if they do switch to winter. And I think that that's probably at the end of the day something that the FFA really need to prioritise because they need eyeballs on these games. There have already been suggestions that perhaps Fox Sports aren't as interested in rugby. I mean, in that rugby as well, in football as they have been in the past, and that certainly seems to be the case. I personally think that they need to play in summer. Yes, the football standard's not as great, but just think of how, when the A-League was going great guns 5 years ago, it was still being played in summer and we were seeing some great football. The Wanderers won the Asian Champions League. This isn't like, we're going to see this huge drop off. So I think it needs to stay in summer, but I'm not a football purist. And to be perfectly honest, I probably wouldn't be as watching as much of it if it was competing with those other leagues. We're in a completely unique environment in Australia where we do have so many football codes, so many sporting codes. And to compete with the juggernauts that are AFL and NRL is very, very difficult.
Yeah, it's a blessing and a curse, and I'm sure that my household, when my wife and I are trying to toss up who gets to watch which team in which code at which time, is not the only one in Australia like that. Nat, fantastic to catch up with you and get your take on so many big stories in Australian sport. Before I let you go, a couple of updates from the French Open. It's not looking great for John Millman. He's down 2-0 to Carina Busta in Spain, but that third set currently at 5-5. Of course, we saw Alex de Minaur. He was knocked out of that Open yesterday, as well as James Duckworth. Lexi Popperin, the next Aussie to play, but as it stands at the moment, no Australian men through. Better news in the women's with Daria Gavrilova and also Astra Sharma, who came into the French Open as a lucky loser from qualifying. She's through to the second round as well, so let's get behind the Aussie women Thanks so much for jumping on the show again today, Nat, and looking forward to chatting more with you during the final series and also with the Bledisloe Cup not that far away.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait. Thanks for having me, Pete.
You've been watching and listening to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. We'll see you tomorrow with Darren Parkin. Cheers.